Hi, this is Jeff Peterson, and this is my American Civil Rights Movement final artifact. Um, in this presentation here, I will obviously introduce you here, talk about the structure of the artifact, which is a hyperdoc. I'll go over some of the obviously personal and professional goals I set at the start of the course, as well as review how I've achieved some of the course outcomes. I'll take you through the artifact, including some source review per my Module 3 feedback. I will talk about obviously which components of Danielson's framework I've hit, and then take you through a little personal review of the experiences, challenges, benefits, and takeaways from this project. In Module 1, I said that my goals for the course were to look at different ways to approach teaching the civil rights movement. And I think I have done that, as I'll discuss here as we get further into the presentation. I think I've developed some quality lessons within both the course as well as in this artifact. But most importantly, I think I'll teach my students about some of the, I think one of the big goals was that I want to teach my students about the progress that both was and was not made during the civil rights movement, because I think there are far too many people in the United States right now that believe that the civil rights movement helped move African Americans towards complete equality. And obviously that is not the case. So there are some things that need to be covered in that regard. And I'll go over that in the presentation here. In terms of the course outcomes, all of those course outcomes listed in the syllabus are not necessarily represented in this artifact, although I think they've been represented throughout like the discussion boards and so on and so forth. But some of those course outcomes included analyzing why education was racially segregated in the 50s, how integration began, and the challenge of integrating schools. I think I hit on that pretty in depth here, as you'll see on the actual hyperdoc itself, where students are looking in depth at things like Brown versus Board and some of the reaction to that. So students should clearly understand how schools were segregated, how integration began, and that it wasn't a smooth process, that process of integration. The freedom rides and other techniques of peaceful protest are studied within this particular artifact. Martin Luther King is a big focus of this artifact, as well as is his belief in nonviolent resistance. So students should have a fairly solid understanding of peaceful protest and what that looked like, nonviolent resistance and what that looked like. This learning activity is cooperative and looks a lot at the principle of nonviolent resistance with a focus on Martin Luther King, as well as some of the actions of people like Rosa Parks and say the Montgomery bus boycott. I do have an activity that specifically focuses on comparing Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, including how they were different. And that's a big focus here, as you'll see. And then I do have a focus here on the Freedom Summer of 1964 and some of the results of that movement. So as the hyperdoc moves on, you'll see that some of these course outcomes are clearly achieved within this artifact, and the few that I left off here have been addressed in other discussion posts. And those ideas would be incorporated into a longer unit of study, whereas this hyperdoc is really like, I'd say more like 5 to 6 lessons total, 5 to 6 days-ish. And how you want to break that down in terms of lessons could differ. So here is the final artifact. So this is a hyperdoc, and those are used very commonly, obviously, throughout education now, but especially in my department, and especially for activities such as this. Hyperdocs are awesome because all the resources that students need to complete them are embedded in the hyperdoc. Students take their notes or respond to questions right in the hyperdoc. They're able to work on this at their own pace, and it's accessible at any time as long as they have internet access. So the more I've obviously used hyperdocs, the more I've become a bigger fan of them, and the more students have seemed to really kind of latch on to, really gravitate towards the usage of these. So this hyperdoc itself would be given kind of as a second part of a civil rights unit. So after basic summaries of a lot of key events are taught, and you'll see that in the hyperdoc, on the left side in part 4, there are very basic summaries given of some of these civil rights events or individuals. And that's because some of these basic summaries would be taught earlier, and now this would be looking more so at the response people had to these. So parts 1 and 2 would be taught in one period, and I'll take you through those in a minute. Part 3 would probably be taught in one period. Part 4 would probably take 2 periods, and part 5 would probably take a period. Um, like I said, this would probably take about a week, but it could be longer. I definitely don't think it would be shorter than a week. So the student objectives for this artifact, this hyperdoc, are for students to learn about several key events and individuals of the civil rights movement, to look at the reactions different communities in the U.S. had to those events and individuals, and this includes not just the reaction of, say, Caucasian Americans to some of these things, but also the reaction from African Americans to some of these events and individuals. So another big component of this would be to have students evaluate the reasons for which those that fought and wished for civil rights had different preferences on how to earn equality and end racism, prejudice, discrimination, and segregation. I think it's really important students understand, and we as a society understand, that people had a lot of different preferences. I think when we talk about the civil rights movement too often, most of the focus is on Martin Luther King Jr., but there were people like Malcolm X as well who had different ideas on how to address equality, racism, prejudice, discrimination, and segregation. Now, whether or not I am achieving these course outcomes or these student objectives, as I wrote them, will be determined by student assessment. I have different components of assessment included in this hyperdoc, and whether or not students are understanding those course outcomes or these student objectives would be assessed in the activities students complete in the hyperdoc, which are then assessed with rubrics that are included in the hyperdoc as well as in this presentation. I'll talk about those in a minute. So there is an assessment component, and I could always obviously alter this as time goes on if I need to incorporate some direct instruction to ensure that students are synthesizing information and incorporating, or comprehending, I should say, what they do need to understand. I can do that. I generally think that as the hyperdoc gets constructed, students will start to draw the correct conclusions, but we have a whole class discussion at the end of the hyperdoc, at the end of this activity, that would allow me to help students maybe connect any final dots, or would help me to continue to assess them. So one thing that I wanted to include here in Module 5, that teaching tolerance article from Module 5 that talked about how to teach the civil rights movement, how to approach it differently than in the past, I thought was absolutely fantastic. And I really like some of those components about focusing on the opposition. I always think that when we teach civil rights, we tend not to look at the fact that there were a lot of people who resisted, or if we do talk about resistance, you know, people being um, people being murdered or shot with fire hoses, doused with fire hoses, I should say, or having something dumped on that at a lunch counter. We kind of just say, well, this happened, and then we move on. And it's important that we understand there was a lot of opposition to the civil rights movement. And I thought that was a key point of that teaching tolerance article that I liked. And I thought that leads into that idea that we must resist telling a simple story. The civil rights movement isn't as easy as Martin Luther King Jr. had this idea of equality, and he preached nonviolent resistance, and he had some success, and that's that. There was a lot of unseen, as the teaching tolerance article talks about. There are a lot of things that we don't teach that students need to know to help them comprehend the civil rights movement and the reaction to it. And that's why I think I used the word reaction several times throughout the presentation and throughout the hyperdoc itself. But another key component of that teaching tolerance article from Module 5 that I liked was this idea of that this connects to the present. And I think you see this with some infighting in, for example, like the Democratic Party today, is that, in, say, the Democratic Party today, you have a lot of people who have broadly similar goals, but wildly different ideas of how to achieve that goals. And I think you can see it, maybe splintering or eroding the unity of the Democratic Party. So I do think that there is connection to the present. I think students need to understand that, if you have common goals, how you achieve those goals is it can differ. And that's true not only in, say, political parties today, but even when students get a job, how they accomplish a project at work. There may be different ideas in terms of how to finish something. So I thought the extension component was interesting. So getting to the artifact itself, this is just the introduction and directions, which kind of touches on what students will be doing and how to complete it. In part 1 here, I have some general thought. I have some thought generators that I always tend to use with students. So just some questions about how experiences early in life can influence beliefs and values as people grow older. And I really use this to help students understand how Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X can arrive at such different ideas for how to achieve equality or lack thereof, or integration or lack thereof. Early experiences shape our opinions later on, um, as well as events change our beliefs and values as we grow older. And then this last thought generator question about violence, is something that in the civil rights movement, was violence ever justifiable in the face of all the resistance that African Americans faced? Would it ever be justifiable for them to resist violently, as Malcolm X sometimes advocated for? So I want students to start thinking about, how our experiences shape what our beliefs and attitudes are later, and how that obviously shaped the beliefs of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. And I think that also will come back to tie in later. So in part two, I just give kids some basic definitions of words that will be used frequently: equality, racism, prejudice, discrimination, segregation, integration. These are all from Webster's dictionary. And I give students the link as well as the definition there, so that when they read these terms and have to use them, they clearly know them. In part three of the hyperdoc here, I have a comparison of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. I have their history.com bios, which I think does a really good job of showing how their early life experiences shaped their beliefs and values, as well as speeches that they gave, as well as that digital history lesson from module 2 or 3 that I thought was really fantastic. And then I just asked students to look at how their beliefs regarding equality, racism, prejudice, discrimination, segregation, integration differ, and how those viewpoints could have become that different. So in my module 3 feedback, you ask for some examples of sources, what students will find when they look at these sources. So this is just an excerpt from Malcolm X's speech that is alluded to here in his message to the grassroots, where he talks about the fact that violence is sometimes necessary to achieve goals. So this is the type of information that students will be finding when they look at some of these resources. So I wanted students to get to have that understanding that not everyone involved in the civil rights movement had the same idea for how to achieve equality. So that takes us into part 4. In part 4, I have students looking at 5 key events of the civil rights movement from the end of the Civil War all the way up through the Selma to Montgomery March. So I have students first looking at post-Civil War legislation that was passed to move African Americans toward equality. But then again, the key idea of part 4 here is that students are looking at the responses. They're looking at the unseen. They're looking at that non-simplistic story that the Teaching Tolerance article talks about. So they're going to look at how people responded to this legislation, which ended slavery, which gave African Americans citizenship and allowed them to right to vote. Because as I often tell my students, the Civil War didn't just end and all of a sudden equality was achieved. People resisted. So on this right-hand column throughout part 4, students are always looking at what the response was of those who oppose these events, and they have articles here that will help them. In this article, students would see that, for example, in response to the end of the Civil War, the Ku Klux Klan was created, and that was a response to the idea that African Americans were moving towards achieving equality. The next event is Brown v. Board, and again, we have these summaries, and on the right here, students will look at the response. One thing I did include here now in these right side and all these responses are the specific words to use so that students understood which words they should be using, and they can synthesize those concepts. So in part 4 in Brown versus Board, looking at the response to that, students should learn that even though Brown v. Board passed, there was a ton of resistance to integrating schools and providing students with an equal education. So again, here's kind of an example of those sources that students will look at and the information they will find. I have students then looking at Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott. I have a few different articles here which look at the response that people had to her actions and to the bus boycott itself. Here's another example of what students would read within those sources that are provided, where you can see that the response, there was not just passive acceptance of these things that were done by civil rights advocates, so that's the idea in these response columns. Students will be looking at the Freedom Summer, and they will see here, like in this particular passage, that there was a ton of violence that occurred when various groups working together went to Mississippi to help get out the African American vote. So again, here is that source review, and then my last activity there, my last event in part 4 is the Selma to Montgomery March. And here, students are actually just watching a video, and I screenshotted just one of the images from that video. So the idea here behind all of these different behind these responses in part four, is that students understand that things were not peachy keen. Things did not go smoothly. There was a ton of resistance to African Americans' attempts to achieve equality. And that's where you kind of weave in Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. After a certain amount of time, when nonviolent resistance is met with violence, there were some civil rights advocates who believed that violence as a response to violence was justifiable and was something that was needed because progress either wasn't being made or wasn't being made fast enough. And I want students to understand that there were those disparate beliefs about the civil rights movement within the civil rights movement about how African Americans could obtain equality, whether or not integration was even a feasible, desirable goal. There were differences of opinion, I think is important to understand. So that part four will be assessed just with a simple knowledge and application of content rubric that is uniformly used throughout my department. So this just kind of looks at student comprehension. Are they reading the correct things, pulling the correct information, using it correctly? Are they applying what they're learning? Finally, the hyperdoc ends with part five, with a whole class discussion where we will talk about what the civil rights movement sought to achieve, where we will look at part three and start to understand that there were divergent differences of opinions and viewpoints and beliefs in regard to whether or not equality was desirable, whether it was achievable, feasible, whether or not integration was, and if using violence to try and obtain those things was prudent. So that is something that would be included. And then I asked students to kind of finish with this idea of like, had you been involved in the civil rights movement, would you have supported Martin Luther King Jr. or Malcolm X? And they have to do that explaining what they learned, using what they learned. So that would be assessed, that whole class discussion would be assessed with this rubric right here, which again asks them to apply what they've learned, but also speak properly or write their response properly as well. So here are all my citations from the hyperdoc itself. Again, students will be assessed or evaluated indirectly as they work, directly in their assessment pieces there in that final whole class discussion, and then this content would be included on common PLC assessments that we have as well. In terms of Danielson, I think there's a clear knowledge of content. I think I've demonstrated knowledge of students in terms of what they are able to achieve. I have clear instructional outcomes. I've used a ton of resources. I think my instruction is pretty coherent. I have clearly designed assessments that vary in type. I think there's a culture for learning using things like thought generators. I think the classroom procedure of implementing this would be fine. I think expectations are clearly communicated. There question and discussion. There is question and discussion involved. Students are engaged. There is assessment, and if need be, I can be flexible. So I did reflect throughout the completion of this artifact, and did try and grow and develop professionally by enrolling in this course and completing this. So when we get to that final personal review, my experience teaching the civil rights movement, I liked to previously talk about opposition, but never this in depth. And I like the idea that the civil rights movement is not super simplistic, and it's something that I'm eager and excited to touch more on. I've talked about this idea that there were differences of opinions in the civil rights movement, so building on that is something that I'm excited for. There are some challenges here. There are 17 links embedded here. So it is a lot of resources to students to consume, but I've tried to pare them down to only certain sections of those different links. So I think it is manageable. Students would benefit enormously by learning, obviously, about this information, about these events, and this idea that the civil rights movement there wasn't this uniform agreement and everybody didn't just passively accept it. And African Americans today are still fighting for equality. They're still fighting to end racism and prejudice and discrimination. Students will gain a ton here in terms of their content knowledge, in terms of learning about how there was opposition, that this wasn't a simple movement, and that there was a huge unseen portion of this movement that has not, frankly, been taught a lot in the United States. So again, there is a lot of relevance to African Americans in learning about their past, but also applicable, like I said earlier, to things like political parties today. And I think some of the other takeaways is that, we continue to have these struggles for equality in the United States, and we need to ask hard questions about whether or not equality exists, whether or not we're still moving towards it. And this last idea, this last key takeaway is that um, historical events, society changing, these are all part of larger patterns and processes where a group pushes, but they meet resistance, and they push and they meet resistance. There's this pendulum that swings back and forth between progress and backsliding away from progress. So that's kind of those key ideas that, like, I think too often we just believe that, well, if we say a group's equal, they're equal, and we don't understand that not everyone has the same beliefs regarding who should and should not possess equality, and so on and so forth. History is not easy. Advancement and progress is not easy either. So with that is kind of the end of my presentation. Thank you.